Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 23rd SF Doc Fest. We're so excited to be joined here today by some of our local filmmakers. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you for our digital screening and when we get to see you in person at the Roxy Theater. Welcome. I would love to kick things off by just having you tell us your name, what film you're here with, and kind of what the genesis of the film was. How did you come to tell this story? And Sharon, hi, welcome.
Gotta unmute. Okay. Hi, Sarah. Yeah, my name is Sharon Yamato. I was the writer, producer, director on this film called One Fighting Irishman. Um, as far as the genesis of it, I guess my goal in my work has always been to expose the injustices of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. It's a subject that's now been it's been covered a lot by other films, which I am really happy to see. But what I always tried to do is find the little known stories. And this happened to be a story that I think needs a lot more attention. And that's what happened at this one particular uh, incarceration center, which became segregated. Uh, Beyond the segregation of Japanese Americans, it was the place where they sent what they considered the bad people. And that's why I think it's really important to focus on. So that I guess that sort of answers your question, I hope.
Sharon, how did you find this particular story? Obviously, there's a lot of accounts of the atrocities of the Japanese incarceration, but like this is a very specific story. How did you come upon it?
So my interest has always been in exposing like the little known stories. This one I discovered, I happened to be a regular attendee of a pilgrimage that at the Tule Lake Segregation Center that happens every other year. So back in the 90s, I started going to these pilgrimages. And then in 2014, I met the son of the protagonist of my film, Wayne Collins, whose son is also named Wayne Collins. But I met him. He spoke at the pilgrimage, and he talked about things that I had no idea had happened during World War II, and that primarily had to deal with, the organizations that we traditionally consider socially liberal, like the ACLU, and that were designed to help people who were suffering from civil injustices, were actually not on our side. And that was something that really kind of was shocking and scary to me. So, and he went into great detail about the work that his father did fighting these organizations who really did nothing to help the Japanese Americans, did very little to help the Japanese Americans during the war. And the other organization that was frighteningly non participatory is our own Japanese American Citizens League, which was set up specifically to protect Japanese Americans. And in fact, they were more aligned with the mainstream government because they wanted they wanted Japanese Americans to show that they were loyal. And so anyone who wasn't considered loyal, they really did nothing to help them. And in fact, did probably more to harm them. So those were the two things that drew me to the story. Able to hear Wayne Collins speak about it, his son, and that's what introduced me to his father, who was really a civil rights hero that nobody really knew about, and very few still know about it, except for the people that he saved at Tule Lake. And those people, he walks on water for them. He is just a huge hero because they would not be American citizens, and they were born here if it were not for the Wayne Collins, the attorney. So
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I would love to jump over to Ethan and Wendy. Welcome. Ethan, I would love to start with you. Introduce yourself, tell us what the film is, and how you came to tell this story. And then Wendy, I'd love to hear how you also became a part of it and kind of how this uh, ties into your work and things that you've been engaging with.
Thank you. And my name is Ethan Goldwater. I am the director and one of the producers, and I did camera work as well on the film. The film is called Carrying Capacity. It's an adaptation of part of Carl Dieseroth's book Projections: The New Science of Human Emotion, which I read kind of in the middle of the pandemic. Was excited to hear it existed. I got the book, read it, and then was raving about it at a kind of pandemic basketball league that I was lucky to get in Berkeley. And someone said, "Oh, I know someone who works in his lab." So they introduced us, and then I got introduced to Carl, and he was really receptive to giving us an opportunity to adapt. And then we met up, took a tour of the lab where I met Wendy, and then we shot it. We all worked together, learned. I mean, it was a huge learning opportunity just to dive into neuroscience and understand what basic research is, and the world that Wendy's been working in for a long time. So I'll let her tell you a little bit about the story and autism research, and what led us also to our kind of one of the protagonists in the film, Mr. Charles.
Okay, well, I guess, thank you, Ethan. So I'm Wendy Wenderski. I am I don't even know if I would call myself a neuroscientist. I'm a biologist, but I work in Carl Dieseroth's lab as a postdoctoral researcher, and I am studying autism in the lab. That's one of the areas that I study. But yeah, I became involved in the film because, well, I had listened to Projections, and Carl Dieseroth, the author, and my mentor, my scientific mentor, so he's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and his book kind of shares his stories of experiences with patients, but also sort of like what he learned and was inspired by from the patients, and like insights that he got from talking to them about, what could be going on in their brain, how the neurons are firing differently, maybe in a person with autism. And maybe more specifically in autism, there's sort of more reactivity of the neural activity in the brain, such that people with autism might become more overwhelmed more easily. So yeah, so he was speaking with one of his patients, and the patient said that eye contact was just overwhelming for him, and that inspired a whole line of research in our lab, demonstrating that basically, yeah, the neurons are essentially overwhelmed, and it's reflected that way. So yeah, anyway, I became involved just like how Ethan said. He walked through the lab, we met, and then I love storytelling. My mom's a painter, my dad is an actor, so it's visual storytelling's in my blood too. So that's how I got into it.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Hi, Cassidy. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi. So my name's Cassidy Friedman. I'm really glad to be back at SF Doc Fest. Guys, this feels so good. Some familiar faces, and just I love this. I love hearing what everybody's up to and these other great film projects. Our film, Ambassadors of Hope, is which I co-directed with Amber Allen Pearson, who's also a Bay Area native. She and I teamed up with Gloria Simino, who founded Harambe Arts, which is an expressive arts program that's based in Kenya and Nepal, but funded here. And it's kind of her brainchild. She came about it sort of to save her own life, expressive arts, and it sort of gave her meaning and purpose. And she invited me to tell the story of the work that they're doing in Kenya. And for me, my style, my approach is, I feel like director feels like it's a misnomer. I try to sort of hold space for people to tell their stories. And so when she invited me in and she said, "You got to meet this guy who's been with the program since its inception. He sort of was born or baptized into the program back in when he was like 8 years old. The Kibera slums in Nairobi were on fire, literally, and he was just a little kid. He was like 8 or 9, and expressive arts is what kind of gave him meaning. It's what gave him purpose. It's what helped him sort of find himself in the chaos, where he was basically a latchkey kid. And his story was representative of what a lot of kids go through there. It's sort of when I went there, it felt like the city of lost children. Children were like babies were raising younger babies, and their parents were too busy trying to survive to be able to pour into their children the way that kids need to be poured into. And that's what the expressive arts was doing. It was saying, you have something inside of you. There's something good in there. We want to hear it. Doesn't matter what it is, share it with us. And so the film itself is just kind of trying to observe that phenomenon. Like, how is it that young people who feel lost and sort of are faced with some of the harshest realities of hunger, starvation even, that they're able to find meaning through expressive art? How does that work? And we just try to throw away all the spinach and broccoli and just give you the sort of the heart and the observed essence of that, rather than try to say, this is why it matters, rah, 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 which has always been our approach.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you all here. I would love to shift back to Sharon. Sharon, I would love to dig deeper a little bit into your process of really approaching this story, because, at face value, there are some elements that I think shine a light on the issues of Japanese incarceration that we don't always think about, which is like kind of like infighting and pressure, not just from, the government doing the treacherous things that it had done, but all of these other kind of social and cultural pressures to like pick a side. I think we're very much so living through sometimes that feel draconian, and though we don't have incarceration camps here in the States right now, like what's happening to students, what's happening overseas, I think you can make some comparisons to the way that people pull allegiances and talk about what team they're on, I guess, is maybe the best way to describe that in a time of incredible social pressure and strife. Oh, I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, that's a great
There
question.
we go.
It really is. It has, I had to tread on it very lightly, because I think because I'm Japanese American, and because we're talking about my community, and I know that Japanese Americans in general have this very, they don't want to be depicted as evil in any way, and not that these people were evil, not that there were factions at this segregation camp. First of all, they were segregated, it was overcrowded, they were put there because for this really bizarre reasons of why they were chosen as those who were disloyal. So I like to refer to it as a person has called it an insane asylum. Really, I say it's a pressure cooker, because they're people thrown together, close quarters. There are people who are trying to show their loyalty, and those who are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to, the government's doing this to me. So these two factions pitted against each other is not a subject that people like to talk about, because as Japanese Americans, we like to think that we're all like, great and happy and wonderful people. Wayne Collins the protagonist of the film, took a very wise position on this, because he said, we wouldn't be in this position if it weren't for the US government. We wouldn't be pitted against each other. So despite the fact that there were these conflicts within the camp, it was created by the fact that we were there in the first place. And it literally, that nothing could be truer. However, we don't like to look at the ugly part. We don't like to look at the fact that, I'm trying to think of comparisons to today, because it was really awful. I mean, there were killings, there were there was a whole slew of beatings, vicious, Japanese Americans pitted against each other. And it, it came, I think, out of the situation. It grew out of the fact that we were, in this horrible place. And on top of it being a concentration camp, it was also segregated even more. There were more guards there. There were tanks. There were military. They were put in a prison within a prison. So the atmosphere there was far worse than in any of the other 9 camps. And yeah, it's really sad. I mean, I look at what's happening today, and it's so difficult to figure out, what side are you on? It's really a mess, and it's really sad because I think people pitted against each other, that this is the result. So I'm glad that I definitely have to give this more thought, because I think that is definitely, you can really draw that comparison to what was going on within the camp. But again, we were already imprisoned, so we were within barbed wire to begin with. So that made it even worse, I think, than what the conflicts that are going on today. So that's great.
That's really beautifully put. And thank you so much. I mean, Sharon, obviously we fully recognize, right, this is coming from a place of generational trauma. And still coping that and unpacking that. And I think that this is a story that really does need to be told from within the community. So really thank you for kind of taking the reins and helping to bring this to light. I think it's really special, particularly being able to show this in the Bay Area, that I think has both like very beautiful and strong Japanese and Japanese American communities and Irish American communities. So it really kind of just is a testament to the makeup of San Francisco in particular, but then the Bay Area as a whole. So thank you so much for sharing that story with us.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I know that there's people who don't want to talk about it still, because it was a very shameful.
It's a hard thing to unpack, but I think it's important that we have open dialogues to kind of, right, if we don't look at the past, we're not going to be able to see what's 10 feet in front of us. And so I think that it's really important to share stories like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ethan and Wendy, I would love to jump over to talk about your film. What I think is really interesting is your ability to visualize complex, like neurological theories, right? I guess maybe not theories, but like the work within, I think you do a really good job in like drawing this comparison in a visual filmmaking way. And I would love to just hear from both of you to really dig into that a little bit. I think you guys can maybe point at one another if you think you want to kick off first. I won't put that on there, but like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Like how do you decide to like approach this from a filmmaking standpoint and approach this from a way that is telling a story that feels like an accurate representation of the work that you're doing, Wendy?
Wendy, you want to start and talk? Well, I mean, I'm okay. I'll go in. Yeah, and to kind of weave into this conversation a bit more about kind of holding space the way Cassidy was talking about it, and talking about challenging things to unpack. This kind of gets at one of my big interests, the intergenerational trauma and kind of the biological basis of that, and trying to understand kind of the nature of disorder and kind of just making sense of all the suffering that happens. And the book is, has been, I think Carl's point of view has been described as kind of a war reporter like perspective. He's doing his residency in emergency psychiatry, and so he's describing all these experiences he's having in the emergency room, people dealing with all kinds of incredibly traumatic experiences, and and he's working with them and their families, and then he's kind of describing almost 2 decades of research in the lab since that kind of time that he did the residency. So the book kind of goes back and forth, different time scales. I mean, it talks about goes back to 20,000 years ago, up to the present day, and that perspective, or the ability to speak in ways that reflect on these different timescales, really inspired me to think about mental health and helping people understand potentially what's going on in the brain, and also helping people who are suffering feel more understood. I think those are Carl's words, and I think what he's tried to do in kind of weaving these stories together. So there's a lot of stories in the book. We got lucky enough to get introduced to the real person who was anonymized in the book. So he was brave enough to kind of show up in real life, welcome us into his life, his home, introduce us to his cats, and then ultimately a childhood story came out, which led to a visit up to Mount Umunhum, which was a really beautiful moment to share with him too. So it kind of it was interesting to connect with Charles, because he is highly averse to eye contact, and social communication in real time is really exhausting for him. So he had a lot of kind of specific guidelines for how he wanted to work together. But once we were able to kind of hash all that out, he was really brilliant collaborator, and very charismatic, I think, and showing the relationship between the patient and the doctor, and then who's then also this brilliant engineer and researcher, I think kind of weaves together a lot of different perspectives on the suffering, and these very kind of prescient conversations about neurodivergence and mental health.
Awesome. Thanks so much. How was that process for you, Wendy?
So I'm thinking about your question, and specifically about also like adapting science for film. And I think that, first of all, that's a really difficult thing to do because it's so abstract. But like what Ethan said, we had the privilege to meet this, a character from the book chapter, Charles, and he's really like the center, I would say, of our story. And one of the messages of the book that really resonated with me, that I loved, that I hope that we convey in our film, is this concept that neurodiversity is actually a benefit to our whole species. It is like why we're so successful. And there are lots of examples of that in the book. But I think I hope, by showing Charles and letting him tell his own story, that you can see that it's true. I mean, he's absolutely a genius, and he builds computers and cloud computing, and completely and thoroughly understands this in a way that like I could never understand. And he's really incredible at telling his story too. So it's not just like, there's a very blanket statement that autism is characterized or diagnosed by like deficits in social communication, as well as repetitive or restricted interests. But he tells his story in this incredibly clear, thoughtful way, and really charismatic, I would say too. So yeah, he's really, I think, like the star of the show. And in terms of adapting the science, I do think that is a challenge. There is thankfully a lot of footage also of Carl explaining the science, and we have some footage that we took too that I think he does a good job, like trying to convey it in a way that people can understand and relate to. So yeah, but of course it is kind of challenging to explain that part.
No, I think that you guys really did achieve, in the way that you tell the story, a way that you're able to like follow the through line and make it accessible. Then there's some like really cool visual things, right? Like when you see the chart, like that breaks out like how all of like these different systems are connected. They're like, oh, of course. It's like I'm watching the like in Hackers. Anyone see the movie Hackers? They like visualize what the internet is like in the early 90s. And to me, that's like one of my favorite things about visual storytelling, is that you can really like access these like tropes. So thank you both so much. And I love that you bring up Charles, because I really have been thinking about this in terms of ambassadors as well. Like, what is it to have the platform to tell your own story from within versus just saying, like, you know, for example, we're here in the States and we're running this program and this is our perspective on it. Like really hearing from Samson, excuse me, like what that journey has been from somebody who has that lived experience, who's come through that system, and like what that impact is. So Cassidy, I would really love to hear from you about what it was like coming from like a very Western perspective and like going and actually meeting the people on the ground who are running these programs and talking to those that actually have the real life impact.
Yeah. Well, first off, like with all my films, like I find a person. I don't try to sort of like hop on board of an understanding of a lot of people. I just go really deep with one person. And all of my work consists really in relationship building and trust building, and like really getting to a point with them where like they feel like I'm hearing them before we even roll camera. And Samson is somebody who, like, we didn't make it up. He's that quiet. He's like, he doesn't share of himself freely. And I was thinking so much hearing Wendy and Ethan just now talk about their main character, and like, and in so many ways it reminds me of Samson. Like we don't see a lot of Samsons depicted in the mainstream media. And I think that like, yes, the cultural differences between Nairobi and America are great, but I felt like the biggest difference between him and me is I just talk nonstop. Like I'm a talker, I'm an out loud processor. And so getting to a point where I was able to quiet myself enough and really hear in the subtlety of what he would say, rather than try to, I think like, you know, I'm so programmed to see heroes as like these kind of big, charismatic, sort of like, you know, eloquent, sort of inspiring. And like Samson would try to like, he would go to the bathroom in the middle of a scene and like disappear for like a half hour to get away. And so like, then I would have to go check in with him and be like, are we okay? And that like repeated checking in and building trust, then rebuilding it, doing the daily check-ins, really like getting him to a point where like, I'm like, you know, just because he says he's up for it doesn't mean he's going to be up for it tomorrow. Especially understanding like when we would have an appointment the next day and he would show up 2 to 3 hours late. I couldn't understand like being, you know, from this culture, like, I'm like, what happened? And then as I got to understand his life, it's like he had to take 2 to 3 buses. And sometimes like one of the buses would break down and he would be stuck, you know, hours away in the morning. And just the getting an appreciation of how hard it is to simply show up, period. And then to be able to be on camera and to give himself and to find this whole process empowering, which was the whole goal of it. Like to me, it's like, yes, I'm glad people like the film. I'm glad that it resonates. But the most important thing is like, does Samson see himself represented in this? And so like, that's the gulp, like hold your breath moment where you share it with him. And I wish Samson could be here with us right now, because he'd be doing his best to hide right now, but you just see him so cheesy, like on his mouth. He'd be so happy to have this moment, and he is happy. And I'll share, of course, everything with him, the reception that this is having, but just
That's so
for him
awesome.
to know that people are seeing him, you know?
I think that's one of the really special things about filmmaking, especially I think in the documentary space, is making space for those to be seen when we're not going to always experience those stories. So thank you so much, Cassidy. Unfortunately, folks, we're out of time. So thank you so much to our filmmakers for joining us and to our audiences for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of the festival. Thanks so much.